Your Excellency Gustavo Petro Orrego, President of Colombia, Madam President of the Conference of Parties, Maria Susana Mohammed Gonzalez, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I would like first of all to congratulate the government and people of the Republic of Colombia for taking on this monumental task of hosting the Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity and its related protocols. It has been 8 years, yes, 8 years, since a biodiversity COP has been hosted in Latin America and the Caribbean, and it is heartening to once again be discussing biodiversity conservation in one of the most biodiverse regions of the world. It is recognized that Cartagena is the birthplace of both the Protocol on Biosafety and the Convention on the Conservation of Regional Seas, and it is therefore, my friends, very appropriate to have this year's Biodiversity COP hosted in your country, Colombia. Excellencies, I was heartened by the spirit of cooperation that brought us to the adoption of the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in 2022. I was also proud of the fact that we were able to develop and lay in Parliament in the same year Barbados' National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which serves as the guiding document for biodiversity conservation and management in Barbados, and our primary instrument for implementing the GBF. Concomitantly, I have also committed to strengthening our capacity in this regard by providing the requisite resources to effectively implement our national plan. Nevertheless, as I have said a number of times in the past, national action alone will not solve our global problems. Working together, hand in hand, is the only way that we can address the threats to our environment in a credible manner. I must, however, stress that threats to our environment are really threats to us all, because we rely entirely on our environment, on our biodiversity, and on its ecosystems, for our sustenance, our livelihoods, and indeed our prosperity. So yes, while we must protect our environment, we must be mindful that in so doing, we are also protecting ourselves. This COP16 has been convened with the theme, Peace with Nature. It is a fitting theme. Our conflict with nature has brought us to a point where we are literally under siege on multiple fronts by crises, my friends, of our own making. We are living throughout a climate crisis, one that immediately threatens the lives and livelihoods of people in coastal and low-lying areas, while it readies itself to wreak havoc on the global economy if we refuse to do what is necessary to stop it. For it's not only the coastal areas that are affected, but droughts affect all types of terrain. And indeed, droughts are affecting too many countries at this point in time. Wildfires equally affect terrain that is not coastal. And that too is as a result of this awful climate crisis. At the same time, we watch species and ecosystems disappear due to overexploitation or irresponsible management, and crucially, a lack of resources to implement the corrective actions that we all agree are necessary to reverse this loss. Small island developing states like my own are especially vulnerable to these crises. In our own case, it is both water, as a result of droughts more often than not, that is our biggest problem. We are a water-scarce country, but equally, much of our development is in fact coastal. We do not have the land mass to buffer our critical ecosystems and keep biodiversity areas from forces like invasive alien species, climate crisis, and pollution, all of which threaten to exterminate our natural heritage resources. Equally, we do not have access to the necessary capital to remediate the loss and damage as readily as some of our larger inland neighbors. This makes protecting species like Barbados' leaf-toed gecko from extinction extremely difficult. This is why we cannot afford to turn a blind eye on the unique circumstances of small island developing states. We need to be assertive in our acknowledgement of these circumstances And we need to be responsive in mobilizing the resources to empower small island states to protect our natural environments. As we conclude a second year since the adoption of the Biodiversity Plan, we still have not agreed on a financial mechanism to enable us to implement it. Sounds familiar? Same thing over and over again. Barbados has been committed to this process from its inception, aligning our National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan to the GBF in its zero draft state, in anticipation, my friends, of its approval. In addition, we've already commenced work on updating our national targets in alignment with the approved framework. But we can't be expected to do this work alone. While the Global Environment Facility has been critical in providing resources necessary to do the work that we have been able to do so far, my friends, the current resources are simply inadequate in the face of the scope of work which remains still to be done. Article 20 of the Convention on Biological Diversity commits developed parties to providing the financial resources required for developing countries to implement this convention. I know there are some reservations about the commitment to developing parties to doing our part in implementing the GBF using available national resources. But to those of you harboring those reservations, I simply say, developing countries are among the most diverse in the world. Our societies, our economies, and well-being are reliant on the preservation of our natural resources, and our cultures, indeed, are built on their management and their sustainable use. Reneging on our commitment to implement the GBF is therefore tantamount to suicide for many of us, and reneging on your commitments under Article 20 is similarly a death sentence for many of us. We must each play our part within the context of our circumstances, and equally, we must work together to achieve these shared goals. Many of you know that I've never shied away from a conversation such as this. Developing countries need access to funding that is responsive to our vulnerabilities rather than fixated on our challenges, or worse, that seeks to exploit them. The Bridgetown Initiative 3.0 is our proposal to tackle not just the climate crisis, but also all of the other global public challenges that we face across the world. Indeed, biodiversity loss is critical for us to address in the same way that we do the climate crisis, or preparing and averting the next pandemic, or dealing with the consequences of war and conflict, or indeed dealing with the digital divide that separates us. This initiative, the Bridgetown Initiative that is, proposes that we provide financing without prohibitive conditions, such as high interest rates that make development impossible and that force us to choose between people and planet, or indeed put us into a national debt crisis in many instances. The Bridgetown Initiative says simply that we must change the rules of the game, that we must shock-proof vulnerable economies, and that we must significantly augment the resources that are necessary for us to fight these battles. It therefore seeks to enhance financial flows by providing higher levels of funding for climate action and indeed for other global public goods. And it seeks to leverage private sector finance to fund mitigation and reconstruction where possible. It recognizes that not all funds will come from outside, but domestic resource mobilization is also critical. These principles, my friends, are all applicable under this convention. Funding for biodiversity conservation and management must not come with prohibitive conditions that prevent parties most in need of these resources from being able to access them. If not, we will lose the battle before we start. It must not create environments where more money is spent, indeed on administrative processes of accessing funding and reporting on expenditure, rather than actually doing the substantive work on the ground that benefits our environment and indeed our people. We must increase the available funding to match the ambition of the Biodiversity Plan, and we must do so at a pace that matches the urgency set out by the framework. We are almost halfway through the decade on ecosystem restoration, and the funding goals of the GBF are certainly nowhere near to be halfway met. And that is the case with almost all of the Sustainable Development Goals, as you know. This decade has been rough, particularly on those of us who were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Finally, we need to concretize the mechanism for the international business sector to join us in this fight to reverse biodiversity loss. What we need is not just a call for voluntary action, but indeed a clear policy environment that holds businesses accountable for their roles in meeting goals and targets that we have set for ourselves after consultation. My friends, this is a global crisis that requires a whole of nation, whole of society, whole of world approach. I often say back home that one hand can't clap. Try, just doesn't make any noise. But equally we know that many hands make light work. And these maxims may be easily relatable to this convention. We must work together and focus on our mutual goals. This is the time to remember why we are here, to focus on areas of convergence rather than on the issues that seek to separate us. My friends in Guyana are working aggressively on the establishment of a global biodiversity agreement, an alliance, and we want to work with them because they have walked the walk and not just talk the talk. The rest of us can do it together. We believe that great work is possible if we commit to working together, hand in hand, recognizing that the purpose for which we work is to save both planet and people. For in saving and ensuring our biodiversity, the beneficiaries are both people and planet. I ask that you join us in making this a reality, for this is the mission of our generation. And I fear if we fail to step up to the plate, future generations will not have an equal opportunity to make that definable difference to our biodiversity. Thank you.